They said he was destroying the only thing that could still save him. In the spring of 1873, while every other man in the valley was flattening his land, Elias Morren was cutting his apart, not plowing, not planting, cutting long, shallow trenches curved across his field like deliberate scars, not straight, never straight. They bent and looped in ways that made no sense to anyone watching from the road. Men stopped their wagons to stare. Some laughed, some shook their heads in silence, the kind reserved for waste. Water was scarce here. Everyone knew that. The old hands had survived decades on this plateau by following one rule passed down without question. Make the land smooth, let the water run. Don't let it linger. Lingering water was rot. Standing water was loss. Anything that slowed it was foolish. And yet Elias was doing exactly that, slowing it down, digging graves for his own crops. Someone muttered, this was not a rich valley. Every season was a negotiation with the land. Every board, every tool, every hour of labor mattered. A man who wasted effort didn't just risk his pride, he risked his family. The land itself had already chosen sides. The soil was thinning. The wind stripped it bare each summer. The sun, relentless, white, unforgiving, stole moisture the moment it touched the ground. This was not just heat. This was the thief, radiation pouring down from the sky, siphoning life invisibly, minute by minute. Whatever water reached the surface didn't stay long enough to matter. It evaporated, vanished, taken. Most men fought back the only way they knew how. Speed, drain it fast, channel it away. Get what you can before the thief returns. Experience said this worked. At least, it had worked before. But Elias Morren ignored that experience and chose something else. He chose delay. As the trenches grew, the ridicule hardened. At the church steps, voices dropped when he passed. At the market, jokes were made openly. You building rivers now? Planning to farm mud? Must be nice to have land to throw away. They weren't cruel men, they were practical men. And to them, this looked like madness. The plateau had no patience for theory. No tolerance for experiments. You either followed what had kept people alive, or you paid for it. By early summer, every other field stood ready, flat, exposed, waiting for rain that came less often each year. Elias's land looked broken, unfinished, wounded, and dangerous, because what Elias was doing wasn't just unpopular. It was a direct challenge to the valley's oldest certainty, that water was the enemy if you couldn't control it, that heat was something you endured, not negotiated with, that the land must be forced to behave. No one asked him why he was doing it anymore. They had already decided. When the sun rose higher and the wind began its annual assault, the plateau prepared for another season of loss, and everyone waited to see how long Elias Morren's foolishness would survive against the most efficient killer the valley had ever known. Not drought, but time. Before we uncover what Elias understood that everyone else missed, take a moment to subscribe, because every week, this channel documents a piece of forgotten survival wisdom, not myths, not theories, but real methods tested against nature itself. The next story may not look impressive at first, but neither did this one. Elias Morren did not learn patience on this plateau. He learned it somewhere harsher. Years before he ever owned land here, before the valley knew his name, Elias had worked far south of this place, beyond the green edges of farms, beyond the last permanent wells, a land where mistakes did not announce themselves loudly. They waited. Their rain did not fall often, but when it did, it came without warning, violent, brief, gone before men could react. The newcomers always celebrated it. The ground darkened, the air cooled, hope returned. Then, days later, everything died anyway. Elias had watched it happen more than once. Fields planted with confidence. Seeds laid into soil still damp with promise. And then nothing. The water had run, fast, too fast. It carved narrow paths, stole the topsoil, and disappeared into distances no one could reach. The sun followed behind it like a predator, stripping the land down to bone. The locals never chased the water. They didn't build straight channels. They didn't hurry it away. They slowed it. Not with walls, not with dams. Nothing that fought the land head-on. They shaped the ground just enough to make the water hesitate. Small depressions, curves, interruptions, places where flow lost its urgency and sank downward instead of outward. No one explained it to Elias. They didn't need to. The land explained it. Where water paused, life lingered. Where it rushed, nothing returned. He learned to read soil the way sailors read the sea. By texture, by sound underfoot, by how quickly it surrendered what little it held. Most importantly, he learned what the sun really was. Not warmth, not comfort. A constant extraction force. Radiation pulling moisture upward, molecule by molecule. A thief that never slept, never rested, never negotiated. If water stayed exposed, it was already lost. That was the mistake people made. They thought survival meant moving faster than the sun, but speed was exactly what killed them. Elias carried that lesson with him when he moved north. He never talked about it, never framed it as knowledge. Around here, experience had its own hierarchy, and his did not rank high. So he watched. He watched men fight heat with openness. He watched them flatten land, exposing every inch to the sky. He watched rain hit hard ground and flee as if repelled. And he watched the same story repeat slow enough that no one questioned it. By the time Elias bought his plot, he already knew something most men here did not. This land was not starving because it lacked water. It was starving because it could not hold it. The trenches he dug were not about irrigation. They were not about control. They were about interruption. About denying the sun a clean surface. About forcing water to choose a different direction down. No one in the valley knew this about Elias. To them, he was just another man making a costly mistake. But beneath his boots, the soil was already beginning to understand what the people around him did not. And when the real test arrived, it would not care who had more experience, only who had listened. By midsummer, Elias Morren was no longer just ignored. He was watched. Every morning the sound of metal biting into soil carried across the valley, not the steady rhythm of plowing. This was slower, deliberate, almost surgical. Elias worked alone. He did not rush. He did not straighten his lines when they drifted. Each trench followed the land's smallest inclines, curving where the ground suggested it should curve, flattening where it resisted. To anyone else it looked inefficient. To the valley it looked insulting. A field was supposed to submit, flattened, ordered, predictable. Elias refused to force it. Men began stopping by uninvited. They leaned on fence posts, arms crossed, offering advice that sounded like warnings. You're cutting against the slope. That water will rot your soil. You'll lose half your field like this. Elias nodded. Sometimes he smiled. He never argued. That silence made it worse because what he was building had no obvious purpose. The trenches were shallow, too shallow to store water, too wide to drain it properly. They didn't connect to streams or wells. They led nowhere. Some curved back on themselves, creating pockets that looked accidental, careless, but they weren't. Each trench was positioned to intercept runoff at the moment it gained speed, to break momentum, to fracture flow. Water left alone, it accelerates. It cuts, it strips everything lighter than stone. Convection worked against the land here as well. Hot air rising, pulling moisture upward, feeding the sky at the soil's expense. Radiation from above, conduction below. The entire environment engineered to remove life. Elias was not trying to fight these forces, he was redirecting them. By late July, the ridicule hardened into certainty. At the market, bets were placed quietly at first on how long it would take before Elias abandoned the project. Some said before harvest. Others said before the next rain. One man laughed openly. You're building obstacles for water that barely comes anymore. That man had 30 years on this land. Experience, everyone agreed, was on his side. The problem with experience is that it assumes tomorrow behaves like yesterday. Elias finished the trenches just as the first real storm of the season arrived. It came hard, sudden, violent. Rain struck the plateau like an invasion force, slamming into exposed soil, turning flat fields into slick, fast-moving surfaces. Water ran in sheets, carving straight lines downhill, carrying loose earth with it. From the road, men watched the familiar pattern unfold. Runoff, erosion, loss. Then they looked at Elias's land. The water did not run, it hesitated. It slowed as it met the first curve, spread slightly, lost urgency. Instead of accelerating, it pooled briefly before sinking. The trenches didn't hold water long enough to be seen as ponds. They were not reservoirs, they were interruptions. Moments of indecision forced upon a force that depended on speed. By morning, the storm was gone. So was the water. On most fields, it had vanished downhill, taking soil with it. On Elias's land, the surface looked unchanged, but beneath it, something had shifted. The ground held weight differently. Footsteps sounded duller. The soil compressed instead of cracking. Still no one admitted it. One rain meant nothing. Elias knew that. So did the valley. The real judgment would come from repetition. Storm after storm, heat after heat, and the sun returned quickly. It always did. Radiation resumed its theft, pulling moisture upward, punishing any surface left exposed. On flat fields, evaporation won within days. The soil hardened, microfractures formed, roots struggled. On Elias's land, the curves created shadow, minor, temporary, but enough to deny the sun, perfect access, enough to slow the thief. Men began watching from farther away now. Less laughter, more silence. Not because they believed, but because they were uncomfortable. Something about the land was behaving differently. Still, they told themselves it would not last. The trenches would collapse, the soil would rot, weeds would take over. Nature always corrected mistakes. That was the comfort they clung to. Elias continued working through it all, adjusting small sections, deepening one curve by inches, softening another, not changing the design, refining it. He was not building for success, he was building for survival. And survival, in this valley, was never obvious at first. It only revealed itself when everything else failed. As August burned on and the rain clouds grew rare again, the plateau prepared for the real enemy. Not the storm, but the long, quiet siege that followed. The one that exposed every false certainty and spared nothing that depended on them. The rain did not come back. Weeks passed, then months. The clouds gathered high and thin, drifting without commitment, offering shade but no relief. What little moisture remained in the ground began to retreat downward, pulled by gravity, hunted by heat. This was not a drought announced by catastrophe. This was worse, a slow siege. The sun returned every morning like a commander inspecting a battlefield. Radiation pressed down relentlessly, stripping exposed soil molecule by molecule. Convection carried heat upward, pulling moisture with it, feeding an endless cycle of loss. Fields that had looked strong in spring began to fail quietly. Leaves curled, stalks shortened, color faded. The land was being drained from the inside. Men responded the only way they could. They worked harder. They plowed again, breaking crusted ground, hoping to trap what little moisture remained. It backfired. Each pass exposed fresh surface to the sky. Each cut gave the thief more access. Evaporation accelerated. The soil hardened faster than before. By mid-August, wells dropped measurably, springs weakened, livestock grew restless, pacing dust instead of grass. No one spoke the word yet, but everyone knew it. This was the year the valley would be measured. By early September, the plateau crossed a line it had not crossed in a generation. The soil cracked audibly underfoot. Long fractures split fields into irregular plates. Roots lost contact with moisture entirely. Plants stopped growing, not because they were dead, but because they had nothing left to draw from. It was a perfect environment for failure. The sun did not need to burn hotter, it only needed time. That was when the contrast became impossible to ignore. Elias Morren's land did not flourish, it endured. Where neighboring fields turned brittle, his remained dull but intact. The soil still compressed when stepped on. Cracks appeared later, smaller, less aggressive. Nothing thrived, but something survived. Men began to walk the edges of his field without speaking. They knelt, pressed fingers into the dirt, felt resistance where they expected dust. It made no sense. The same sun struck every field. The same sky withheld rain from all of them. The same wind scoured the surface, and yet the outcome was uneven. By late September, crops in the valley began to fail completely. Harvests were abandoned. Fields left standing only because there was no point cutting what had never matured. Loss was no longer theoretical. It was visible on Elias's land. Yields were low, disappointing but present. Stalks stood where others had collapsed. Leaves remained attached where others had withered into nothing. This was not abundance. This was resistance. The siege intensified. The sun continued its theft. Radiation never paused. Evaporation pulled relentlessly upward. The land gave up what it could, and then refused to give more. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The point where theory collapsed into outcome. No one laughed now. No one spoke at all. They watched as Elias moved through his field, not celebrating, not rushing, just observing, adjusting a trench here, clearing a small blockage there, as if he had expected this, as if this was not victory but confirmation. By the time the first cool nights arrived, the valley understood what had happened, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. They had not lost to drought, they had lost to speed. Water that ran away, soil that exposed itself, heat that exploited every opening. Elias had not created water. He had denied the enemy easy access, and in a year when the land decided who would remain standing, that difference mattered more than experience. The siege finally broke in October, not with rain, but with resignation. Fields lay empty. Families counted losses. Plans were revised downward. Only one field, marked by strange curves and quiet resistance, stood as proof that the valley's oldest certainty had been wrong. The test was over. Nature had delivered its verdict, and it had done so without saying a word. Failure did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in stages. First came denial. Men walked their fields pretending to calculate yields that no longer existed. They measured stocks that would never fill. They spoke of late rains that everyone knew were not coming. Then came exhaustion. Tools stayed leaning against fences. Horses were worked less. not from mercy, but because there was nothing left worth working for. The land had already answered by mid-October. The valley no longer looked cultivated. It looked abandoned. Fields that had been flattened for efficiency now lay fully exposed, their surfaces baked hard and cracked open. The soil had lost cohesion. It no longer held together. Each gust of wind lifted fine particles and carried them away, thinning the land one layer at a time. This was conduction in reverse, heat driving itself downward, turning moisture into memory. Men with decades of experience stood in places where crops should have been, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew. They had done everything right. They had drained efficiently. They had removed obstacles. They had trusted speed, and the land had rejected it all. Livestock suffered next. Pastures failed earlier than expected. Hay stores, already reduced by poor yields, were rationed. Animals grew thin. Some were sold early, others lost quietly to weakness. The valley did not announce these losses. They revealed themselves in absences. Fewer animals at the fence, fewer wagons on the road, less smoke rising in the evening. Elias Morren did not speak during this time. He did not walk the valley offering explanations. He did not invite anyone to inspect his field. He did not compare outcomes. He continued working his land the same way he always had. That restraint mattered because it removed pride from the equation. The collapse was not humiliating, it was instructive. Men began to notice details they had ignored before. How quickly water fled their land during the rare autumn storms. How the soil resisted absorption, repelling moisture instead of welcoming it. How the sun exploited every flat, exposed surface with ruthless efficiency. They noticed these things too late. Experience had taught them what to do, but not why it worked. And when conditions changed, experience became a liability. The valley did not turn against Elias, it simply turned away from certainty. One by one, men walked the edges of his land without comment. They didn't ask questions. They didn't touch the soil. They just looked. What unsettled them was not that his field had survived. It was that it had survived quietly. No miracle, no excess, no defiance of nature, only cooperation. By the end of the season, the roles had reversed. The methods once considered wasteful were now the only ones with evidence behind them. The techniques praised for their efficiency had produced nothing but loss. The confident had collapsed, not because they were foolish, but because they were rigid. Nature had not punished them. It had simply stopped supporting them. And in a land where survival depended on that support, the difference between endurance and failure had become unmistakably clear. The valley was ready for answers, even if it didn't yet know how to ask the questions. The questions did not come all at once. They arrived cautiously. At first, men only asked what could be seen. Why the soil felt heavier underfoot. Why resisted cracking longer. Why plants that should have failed outright had not. Elias Morren answered simply, if at all. He never framed what he had done as a solution, only as a condition. When the first autumn rain finally arrived, weak, scattered, insufficient, it offered something more valuable than relief. It offered comparison. On most fields, the rain struck hardened ground and fled immediately. Water pooled briefly, then raced downslope carrying fine soil with it. Within hours, the surface returned to dust. On Elias's land, the rain did not rush. It broke apart. The curved trenches intercepted flow and stripped it of speed. Water spread laterally instead of vertically. Momentum collapsed. Absorption followed. By the next morning, the surface looked dry, but the soil beneath was not. Men began measuring without saying they were measuring. They drove stakes into the ground to test resistance. They dug shallow test holes. They compared root depth, not yield. The differences were not subtle. Where neighboring fields showed moisture only in the top few inches, Elias's soil held it deeper, protected from radiation, insulated from immediate evaporation. This was not abundance. It was retention. The sun continued its work, of course. Radiation did not relent. Convection still pulled heat upward, stripping exposed moisture whenever it could. But the trenches had changed the geometry of the battlefield. There were fewer clean surfaces, more shadow, more interruption. The thief still stole, but it worked harder for less. By mid-October, the numbers spoke clearly enough that even the most skeptical could not ignore them. Fields that had followed tradition produced losses approaching total failure. Yields fell below half of average, some far worse. Elias's land produced modest returns. In some areas, barely enough to justify harvest, but it produced consistently. Across a season designed to punish excess and reward restraint, consistency mattered more than peak output. Livestock records told the same story. Animals grazing near Elias's field retained weight longer. Pasture did not recover, but it degraded slower. Hay cut from marginal growth still held structure instead of crumbling into dust. These were small margins. But survival has always lived in small margins. The most revealing measure came quietly. Wells near the lower edge of Elias's land dropped more slowly than others uphill. The water table itself had not risen, but it had been drained less aggressively. The land was no longer leaking as fast as before. For the first time, the valley began to understand what had happened. They had not lost water because the sky withheld it. They had lost it because they had handed it away. Speed had been the enemy. Flatness had been exposure. And experience, unexamined, had become a weapon used against them. Elias had not beaten the sun, he had reduced its efficiency. At this point, some of you may be thinking, why isn't this how land is shaped everywhere? If you're an engineer, a builder, a farmer, or someone who has watched systems fail under real pressure, leave your perspective in the comments. I read every response. Because real understanding doesn't come from agreement, it comes from experience. He had not created moisture, he had hidden it. And in a year where the land stripped everything down to fundamentals, that distinction was the difference between standing and disappearing. The truth did not arrive as revelation, it arrived as acceptance. Men stopped arguing because there was nothing left to defend. The land had already chosen, and for the first time the valley was prepared to listen, not to Elias Morren, but to what the soil itself had been trying to say all along. The first man to copy Elias Morren never said a word to him. He arrived before sunrise, alone, carrying a shovel that had not seen much use in weeks. He stood at the edge of his own ruined field, stared at it for a long time, then began cutting shallow curves into the soil. No announcement, no explanation, just work. Others followed quietly, not as a group, not as a movement. One by one, each man choosing a different morning, a different angle, a different excuse for why he was out there so early. No one apologized. They didn't need to. Apologies were for arguments. This was evidence. By the following spring, the valley looked different. Fields were no longer perfectly flat. Subtle curves interrupted long, straight runs. Small depressions appeared where none had existed before. The land, once forced into obedience, was being negotiated with. Elias was rarely consulted directly. Men watched instead. They observed how he adjusted after each rain, how he altered trenches by inches, not feet, how he left certain sections untouched, even when they looked inefficient. They learned without being taught. That mattered, because it meant the knowledge was no longer his. It belonged to the land now. By the second year, the method had no name, no signature, no origin story worth repeating. It was simply described as what works here, and that was its greatest protection. Ideas attached to men can be dismissed. Ideas attached to survival cannot. Elias never claimed credit. When asked why he had done it, he answered the same way every time. The land asked for it, nothing more. Nothing that could be argued with. As seasons passed, the curves remained. Some were refined, others abandoned. What stayed was what endured repeated testing storms, heat, neglect. The rest disappeared without comment. That was the final proof. Not that the method succeeded, but that it survived imitation, misuse, and time. Elias Morren grew older, slower, less visible in the valley's daily rhythm, but the land he shaped continued to behave differently long after people stopped watching him. His legacy was not a technique, it was a correction, a quiet one. And once the valley accepted it, there was no reason to laugh anymore. The land had already spoken. By 2026, the world no longer looks like Elias Morren's valley. Satellites map every contour, sensors measure moisture by the hour. Algorithms predict rainfall weeks in advance. Machines move more earth in a day than a man once did in a lifetime. And still, the land keeps correcting us. Modern fields fail faster now, not because the sun is stronger, but because exposure has become more efficient. Surfaces are smoother, drainage is faster, heat finds fewer obstacles, radiation still steals, convection still lifts, evaporation still wins when given access. The forces Elias worked against have not changed their behavior, only their scale. Today water is moved with pumps instead of shovels. Soil is reshaped with steel instead of hands. Speed is celebrated as progress, efficiency as intelligence. But the outcome is familiar. Runoff still strips land bare. Heat still exploits open surfaces. Systems built to move resources quickly still lose them just as fast. What Elias understood without language, without data, was not a method. It was a boundary. That nature does not reward force, it rewards alignment. In the 19th century, the cost of ignoring that boundary was a failed harvest. In the 21st, the cost is larger, quieter, distributed, depleted aquifers, eroded topsoil, land that produces less each year, no matter how advanced the tools become. The mistake repeats because it feels logical. Flatten, drain, accelerate, it always has, and it always works until conditions change. The land never promised stability, only response. Elias Morren did not outthink nature. He did not defeat it. He did something far more difficult. He slowed down long enough to notice how it actually behaves. That option still exists. The question is whether anyone now is willing to look foolish long enough to use it, because the land is still watching, and it is still keeping score. This story shows what happens when water is slowed. But in the next documentary, we explore how people once kept ice frozen through desert summers without electricity, without machines, and without wasting a single drop. Click the video on screen. I'll see you in the next forgotten battlefield.